Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Chapter 1. A Bitter Bouquet. Agatha Raisin was vibrating with a specific, highly combustible mixture of indignation and indigestion. It was a brilliantly sunny Saturday afternoon in the Cotswolds, the sort of day that looked splendid on a postcard but was, in reality, far too hot for a tailored, wasp-waisted emerald green suit. Agatha shifted her weight from one high-heeled pump to the other, her toes pinched and her temper fraying. She desperately wanted a cigarette. More than that, she wanted to murder Julian Vane. The Castley Spring Charity Bazaar and Floral Exhibition was in full swing on the vicarage lawn. To Agatha's right, the usual suspects were aggressively peddling homemade jams that tasted of regret. To her left, a terrifyingly enthusiastic woman was trying to guess the weight of a marrow. But Agatha's furious, beady eyes were fixed firmly on the judging tent. Specifically, she was glaring at the best amateur mixed bouquet display. Agatha had entered the competition with a magnificent arrangement of orchids, lilies, and something spiky and expensive that she couldn't pronounce. She had called it Cotswold elegance. The fact that she had purchased it from a high-end florist in Mayfair, driven it down the M40 in the boot of her car, and unceremoniously shoved it into a cheap glass vase to make it look homemade, was beside the point. It was the best arrangement there. Yet, the blue ribbon currently rested on a disgustingly rustic spray of wildflowers arranged in a battered watering can. "It's all about the narrative, Agatha," a smooth, condescending voice had told her only 10 minutes earlier. It belonged to Julian Vane, the new wildly popular florist who had opened a boutique in the neighbouring village of Dembley. Julian was acting as the guest judge today. He was in his late 30s, with floppy blonde hair, a silk cravat that Agatha thought made him look like an amateur magician, and a smile that seemed to know everyone's secrets. Orchids are so. London, Julian had sniffed loudly enough for Mrs. Josephs and the entire Women's Institute to hear. They speak of corporate lobbies and desperation, don't you think? Castley prefers authenticity. Agatha's cheeks burned at the memory. Desperation. She, Agatha Raisin, who had run her own highly successful PR firm, being lectured on authenticity by a man who charged £40 for a bundle of twigs and some eucalyptus. She had wanted to snap back, to tell him his cravat looked ridiculous, but James Lacey, her handsome, infuriating and tragically observant neighbour, had been standing just close enough to hear. So Agatha had forced a stiff, terrifying smile and stalked off, her pride stinging far worse than her blistered heels. "Don't take it to heart, Agatha," came a gentle voice. Agatha turned to see Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife, carrying a tray of teacups. Mrs. Bloxby was the closest thing Agatha had to a best friend in the village, a woman of infinite patience and annoying perceptiveness. "I am not taking it to heart, Margaret," Agatha lied flatly. "I merely find it astonishing that a weed arrangement in a rusty bucket constitutes high art. But what do I know? I only lived in London for 30 years. Clearly my tastes are too sophisticated for the country." Mrs. Bloxby offered a sympathetic smile. "Julian does have rather particular tastes, and he is very involved in the community." "He's a gossip," Agatha snorted, eyeing the florist's tent across the lawn where Julian's actual professional displays were set up. "He knows exactly who is buying apology roses for their wives and who is sending secret carnations to their mistresses. The man looks at you like he's calculating your bank balance and your sins. I don't trust him." "Well, he certainly has a flair for the dramatic," Mrs. Bloxby murmured diplomatically. Agatha opened her mouth to deliver a scathing critique of Julian's floristry skills, but the words died in her throat. A scream sliced through the polite hum of the village fete. It wasn't a playful shriek from the children's sack race, nor the shocked gasp of someone dropping a Victoria sponge. It was a high, thin, terrified sound that immediately silenced the brass band playing near the tombola. The scream had come from the stone potting shed at the edge of the vicarage garden, a cool, dark place Julian Vane had commandeered to keep his spare blooms fresh. Agatha didn't hesitate. Before the vicar could put down his tea, or the local constable could finish his sausage roll, Agatha was already marching across the grass, her high heels sinking into the turf with every determined step. "Agatha, wait!" Mrs. Bloxby called out, but it was useless. Agatha shoved her way past a paralysed cluster of villagers. "Excuse me, move aside. Mind your feet, Mrs. Josephs," she barked, pushing the heavy wooden door of the shed all the way open. The air inside was thick with the overpowering scent of lilies and damp earth. It took a second for Agatha's eyes to adjust to the gloom. When they did, her stomach gave a very uncosy lurch. Julian Vane was not looking smug anymore. He was lying flat on his back among a sea of crushed white roses. His floppy blonde hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, his complexion a horrifying shade of mottled purple. Wrapped tightly around his neck, biting deep into the skin, was a length of thick, wire-edged crimson florist's ribbon. Hovering over him, trembling violently and clutching a half-eaten cucumber sandwich, was Miss Simpkins, the village spinster who bred aggressively neurotic spaniels. "He's dead," Miss Simpkins wailed, dropping the sandwich onto Julian's chest. "I only came in to ask for a discount on some petunias, and here he is, dead." Agatha knelt down, grimacing as the damp stone floor threatened her expensive skirt. She pressed 2 fingers to Julian's neck, right above the crimson ribbon. There was no pulse. The man was as cold as the bucket of water resting beside his head. A crowd was beginning to form at the door, murmuring in shocked, thrilled whispers. "Stand back, everyone," Agatha shouted, standing up and brushing dirt from her knees with brisk, authoritative slaps. "Don't trample the crime scene. Call the police. And for God's sake, somebody get Miss Simpkins a sherry before she faints on the evidence." As the villagers scrambled to obey, buzzing with the horrific, delightful news of a murder, Agatha looked down at Julian Vane. Her initial annoyance at the ruined afternoon, and her ruined pride, was rapidly evaporating. In its place, a familiar, intoxicating thrill began to bubble in her chest. Julian Vane, the snide florist who knew everyone's secrets, had clearly known one secret too many. Someone in this picturesque, polite village had hated him enough to strangle him with his own ribbon. Well, Agatha thought, her beady eyes narrowing as she scanned the floor for anything out of place. He may have won the flower show, but I'm going to find out who killed him. And with that, the humiliation of her store-bought orchids was entirely forgotten. Agatha Raisin was on the case. Chapter 2. Thorny Interrogations. Agatha stood before the heavy wooden door of the potting shed like a highly fashionable, deeply irritated gargoyle. She had physically barricaded the entrance, crossing her arms over her emerald green jacket and glaring at anyone who dared step too close. It took exactly 14 minutes for the wailing siren of a police car to shatter the fragile, shocked silence of the Carsley Spring Charity Bazaar. The vehicle crunched aggressively onto the vicarage gravel, and out stepped Detective Inspector Wilkes, looking as crumpled and sour as ever, followed closely by Detective Constable Bill Wong. Bill, a round-faced, amiable young man who considered Agatha an exasperating friend, let out a heavy sigh the moment he spotted her standing guard. "Hello, Agatha," Bill said, adjusting his helmet as he jogged over. "Please tell me you haven't touched anything." "I merely checked for a pulse, Bill," Agatha said crisply. "Unlike the rest of this village, I do not succumb to hysterics, though Miss Simpkins did drop a rather soggy cucumber sandwich directly onto the corpse, which I imagine compromises your pristine crime scene." Inspector Wilkes elbowed his way past his subordinate, his face flushed with the heat and the sheer annoyance of having his Saturday interrupted. "Out of the way, Mrs. Raisin," he barked, his mustache twitching. "This is police business, not one of your amateur sleuthing games. Go and have a cup of tea with the other ladies." Agatha bristled, her back stiffening. "I will have you know, Inspector, that I am the one who secured this area. If it weren't for me, half the Women's Institute would be in there right now, taking souvenir cuttings. And you might want to note the ribbon used to strangle him. It's professional florist's wire. Very strong, very specific." "Thank you, Mrs. Raisin, for doing my job for me," Wilkes said with withering sarcasm, physically ushering her away from the door. "Now go away." Agatha was unceremoniously shooed toward the edge of the lawn, her pride stinging horribly. She smoothed her skirt, wishing desperately for a cigarette to calm her nerves. It was entirely unfair. She was observant, sharp, and usually right, yet the local constabulary treated her like a nuisance. Giving Wilkes a masterclass in forensics, were we? Agatha jumped. She turned to find James Lacey standing near the lemonade stall, 2 plastic cups in his hands. He was wearing a casual linen jacket that made him look impossibly handsome and effortlessly aristocratic. Agatha felt a familiar, infuriating flutter in her chest. She immediately tried to pat down her hair, painfully aware that the humidity was turning her expensive London blow-dry into a frizzy helmet. "Someone has to," Agatha snapped, taking the cup he offered and taking a sip. It was lukewarm and terribly tart. Wilkes wouldn't notice a clue if it danced the can-can in front of him in a sequined leotard. James offered a dry, amused smile. "You do seem to have a magnetic attraction to dead bodies, Agatha. It was just a flower show. How on earth did a florist end up strangled?" "I don't know yet," Agatha said, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the lawn. The initial shock had worn off, replacing panic with the far more dangerous village currency, gossip. Clustered in tight, whispering knots around the bunting, the residents of Carsley were already swapping theories. Agatha casually drifted closer to a group featuring Mrs. Josephs and the village postmistress, told him it was dangerous. Mrs. Josephs was whispering loudly. "You can't just swan into the Cotswolds, charge a fortune for imported peonies, and charm married women without consequence." "I heard he was in terrible debt," the postmistress added, her eyes gleaming with scandal. owed money to some very unsavory characters in Birmingham. And what about that scene he made at the pub last Tuesday, shouting at Mr. Bogle about property lines? Agatha filed this away. Debt, furious husbands, and property disputes. Julian Vane had certainly been a busy man during his brief residency in the neighbouring village of Dembley. "You have that look, Agatha," James said softly, appearing at her shoulder again. He leaned in just close enough that she could smell his expensive shaving soap. "The look that says you are about to do something horribly intrusive and thoroughly illegal." "I have no idea what you mean," Agatha sniffed, trying to ignore the heat rising in her cheeks. "I am merely a concerned citizen. The man insulted my orchids. He called them desperate. The least I can do is find out who shut him up." "Leave it to the police," James advised, though his eyes twinkled with a challenge. "You'll only make enemies." "I already have enemies, James. It comes with having a personality," Agatha shot back, handing him her empty cup. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go home and feed my cats." It was an excuse, of course. Agatha practically marched back to her pristine cottage at the end of the lane. She unlocked the door, ignoring the demanding meows of Hodge and Boswell, and made a beeline for the drinks cabinet. She poured a very generous measure of gin, topped it with a splash of tonic, and sank into her plush armchair. She stared at the blank notepad on her coffee table. Julian Vane was dead, strangled with his own expensive ribbon. The police would bumble through the financial records, but Agatha knew how these villages worked. The truth wouldn't be found in a bank statement. It would be hidden behind polite smiles, passive-aggressive garden rivalries, and the locked doors of the picturesque cottages. She took a long sip of her gin. She had been humiliated at the flower show today. Solving the murder of the judge who insulted her seemed like the perfect way to reclaim her social standing. Besides, her week had been dreadfully boring so far. Agatha grabbed a pen, clicked it fiercely, and wrote Julian Vane's suspects at the top of the page. The village was buzzing, and Agatha Raisin was finally in her element. Chapter 3. The Gilded Peony. Agatha woke on Sunday morning with a dull throb behind her left eye, the undeniable tax of cheap tonic water and righteous indignation. She lay in bed for exactly 3 minutes, staring at the beamed ceiling of her Cotswold cottage, before throwing off the duvet. There was a murder to solve, and lying about in a silk nightgown wouldn't catch a killer. She armored herself for the day ahead. This meant a tailored navy blazer, a crisp white blouse, trousers that forgave absolutely nothing, and a slash of aggressive crimson lipstick. Agatha Raisin did not do subtle, nor did she do Sunday casual. She marched into the kitchen, hastily fed a demanding Hodge and Boswell, and drove her immaculate car toward Dembley, the neighbouring village where the late Julian Vane had established his floral empire. Dembley was, if possible, even more fiercely quaint than Carsley. Its high street was a parade of honey-coloured stone and meticulously curated hanging baskets. At the far end of the lane sat the Gilded Peony, Julian's boutique. It was currently entirely roped off with garish blue and white police tape. Agatha parked illegally on a double yellow line and approached the shop. Standing outside, staring mournfully at the darkened windows, was a young woman in an oversized cardigan and sensible shoes. Agatha instantly diagnosed her as tragically mousy. "Dreadful business, isn't it?" Agatha announced loudly, stepping up beside the girl. The young woman jumped, her pale eyes wide behind thick spectacles. "Oh, yes, terrible. I'm Chloe. I was Mr. Vane's assistant." Agatha's predatory instincts flared. An assistant, a goldmine of scheduling, secrets, and grudges. "Agatha Raisin," she purred, deploying her most professional, utterly fake PR smile. "I am a consultant, looking into the matter for the parish. You look like you need a cup of tea, Chloe." And a very large slice of Victoria sponge. My treat. Before the bewildered girl could protest, Agatha had hooked an arm through hers and marched her down the street to the Dembley teapot. "No, nay." Once seated in a corner booth, Agatha dispensed with the pleasantries the exact moment the waitress set down the teapot. "Now, Chloe, who wanted your boss dead?" Chloe choked on a crumb of shortbread. Pardon? Don't be coy, dear. We haven't the time," Agatha said briskly, pouring the tea. Julian Vane was strangled with his own ribbon. The man clearly had a talent for making enemies. Who was he fighting with recently? Wives? Husbands? Competitors? "Mr. Vane was a visionary," Chloe protested, her eyes welling with defensive tears. "He brought contemporary floral design to the Cotswolds. People just didn't understand him." Yes, a martyr to baby's breath," Agatha snapped, her famously short patience already evaporating. "But who didn't understand him loudly? Who shouted at him?" Chloe sniffled, visibly intimidated by Agatha's terrifyingly intense glare. "Well, there was Arthur Pendleton, the head of the parish council." Agatha paused, her teacup halfway to her lips. Arthur Pendleton was notoriously stuffy, a man who treated village bylaws with the reverence of the Ten Commandments. What were they arguing about? I don't know exactly, Chloe whispered, leaning across the table as if the porcelain teacups were bugged. It happened on Thursday, Mr. Pendleton came into the shop, purple in the face. He slammed a piece of paper on the counter and told Mr. Vane he was a parasite and a blackmailer. Mr. Vane just laughed at him. He told Mr. Pendleton that if he didn't approve the shop's expansion permit, a certain arrangement would be delivered to Mrs. Pendleton. Agatha's eyes gleamed. Blackmail. And from a florist. An arrangement? What kind of arrangement? "A dozen yellow carnations," Chloe said, looking utterly scandalized. Agatha stared at her blankly. Yellow carnations? Is that some sort of Cotswold mafia threat? Chloe sighed, a brief flash of floral superiority cutting through her timidity. In the language of flowers, Mrs. Raisin, yellow carnations symbolize rejection, disdain, and disappointment. But Mr. Vane had a special system. He kept a private leather ledger in his desk. He said flowers were the best keepers of secrets. Some men buy red roses for their wives, but they buy the expensive imported white lilies for their other companions. Mr. Vane knew everyone's billing addresses, and he wasn't afraid to hint at it. He was blackmailing the parish council over an affair. Agatha breathed, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. "Chloe, you are a treasure. Where is this leather ledger now?" "The police took it," Chloe said mournfully. "That Inspector Wilkes was very rude about it, called it rubbish." Agatha rolled her eyes. Wilkes wouldn't know a motive if it slapped him in the face with a wet trout. If Wilkes had the ledger, she would just have to get the information the old-fashioned way, by publicly ambushing Arthur Pendleton. "Right. Thank you, Chloe," Agatha said, standing abruptly and tossing a £10 note onto the table. "Enjoy the sponge." She strode out of the tea room, her heels clicking a rhythmic, deadly march against the pavement. Arthur Pendleton was the most obvious suspect imaginable. He had motive, he had opportunity, and he had the red-faced, sputtering temper of a man who could easily snap a ribbon around a blackmailer's neck. But as Agatha marched back to her car, a nagging thought breached her confidence. If Julian Vane kept secrets for half the county, why would Arthur Pendleton murder him in broad daylight at a public fete, knowing he'd recently been seen shouting at the man? It was too messy. It was too obvious. Agatha frowned, aggressively clicking her car keys. It was a start, but she knew the village ecosystem well enough to recognize a convenient scapegoat when she saw one. She needed to rattle Arthur Pendleton's cage and see what fell out. Chapter 4. Yellow carnations and red faces. Agatha knew precisely where to find Arthur Pendleton on a Sunday afternoon. While the rest of the village was either digesting an overcooked roast or aggressively pruning roses, Arthur held court at the corner table of the Red Lion. It was a local institution, a place where vicious gossip was served alongside lukewarm pints of ale. London. Agatha pushed open the heavy oak door. The pub was filled with the low hum of village life, a stark contrast to the sleek, anonymous wine bars of London. Click to open side panel for more information she used to frequent. She paused for a moment in the entryway, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. She smoothed her navy blazer and checked her reflection in a brass horse brass on the wall. Her crimson lipstick was still flawless. She spotted Arthur immediately. He was a portly man with a face like a boiled ham, currently holding forth to a captive audience of local farmers about the absolute necessity of maintaining the historic integrity of the village phone box. Beside him sat his wife, Marjorie Pendleton, a woman whose entire personality seemed to consist of beige cardigans and a perpetually pinched expression. Agatha took a deep breath, channeled her most ruthlessly effective PR executive persona, and marched across the sticky carpet. "Arthur," she declared loudly, her voice cutting through the pub chatter like a diamond through glass. "Just the man I wanted to see." Arthur blinked, mid-sentence, looking as though a badger had just dropped onto his table. "Mrs. Raisin, we were just discussing the parish council agenda." "Were you?" Agatha pulled out an empty wooden chair and sat down uninvited, signaling sharply to the barman for a gin and tonic. "Fascinating. I suppose blackmail isn't on the official agenda until the any other business section." The silence that fell over the corner table was absolute. Marjorie Pendleton's jaw dropped slightly, revealing a flash of very sensible teeth. "I beg your pardon," Arthur spluttered, his face transitioning from boiled ham to an alarming shade of plum. "Keep your voice down, woman. What on earth are you talking about?" "Oh, come now, Arthur," Agatha said breezily, leaning forward. "The village is buzzing. A man is dead in the potting shed, strangled with a bit of ribbon, and I hear you had a frightfully public row with our late florist, Julian Vane, just this Thursday." Arthur glanced nervously around the pub. Several heads had turned, their owners suddenly deeply fascinated by the contents of their pint glasses. "I am the head of the parish council," Arthur hissed, leaning in so closely Agatha could smell the stale ale on his breath. "I have disagreements with local business owners all the time. It is the burden of leadership." "Yes, but most business owners don't threaten to send your wife a dozen yellow carnations, do they?" Agatha watched carefully, waiting for the explosion. It didn't come in the way she expected. Instead of erupting into violent anger, Arthur went perfectly, horrifyingly pale. All the bluster vanished, leaving a very frightened, rather pathetic middle-aged man. Marjorie, however, did not pale. She leaned forward, her beige cardigan suddenly seeming much less sensible and far more rigid. "Yellow carnations?" she repeated, her voice deceptively quiet. "Arthur, what is she talking about?" "Cotswold's AONB, 4.6, Nature Preserve." "Nothing, dear, nothing," Arthur squeaked. "Mrs. Raisin is she's known for her theatrics. You know how these city people are. They bring all their drama straight into the Cotswold's AONB. Click to open side panel for more information." "I am not theatrical. I am accurate," Agatha corrected coldly. "Julian Vane kept a little leather ledger, a ledger of secrets, and it seems he knew something about you, Arthur, that you desperately wanted kept quiet. So quiet, perhaps, that a piece of wire-edged ribbon was the only solution. I didn't kill him." Arthur slammed his fist on the table, rattling the beer mats. Yes, the man was a menace, a parasite. He was digging into the parish funds, hinting that he knew I'd accidentally. Arthur stopped abruptly, realizing he was confessing to a pub full of eavesdroppers. He lowered his voice to an agonized whisper. "He knew I'd diverted a tiny portion of the church roof fund to pay off a gambling debt. Just a temporary loan. I was going to put it back." Agatha sat back, slightly deflated. A gambling debt. Embezzlement of church funds. It was certainly a scandal, but it lacked the passionate, violent spark of a murder motive. Men like Arthur Pendleton didn't strangle people over church roof funds. They just sweated a lot, and eventually resigned in disgrace. "And the yellow carnations?" Agatha pressed, feeling the neat solution slipping through her fingers. Arthur looked thoroughly bewildered. "I have no idea. He just said it to wind me up." The man spoke in riddles. Agatha frowned. If Arthur didn't know the significance of yellow carnations, then Julian Vane hadn't been threatening him with an affair. He had just been throwing out floral insults. Suddenly, a glass shattered at the adjacent table. Agatha whipped her head around. Standing there, holding the stem of a broken wine glass, was Fiona, the glamorous, fiercely competitive owner of the village beauty salon. She was staring at Arthur, her face chalk white, a spot of red wine blooming like a dark rose on her pristine white blouse. "Oh, goodness," Fiona stammered, dropping the broken stem onto the floor. "So clumsy of me. I really must be going." Without waiting for a response, Fiona turned and practically ran out of the pub. Agatha narrowed her eyes, ignoring Arthur's continued frantic explanations about the roof fund. Her mind was racing. Why would Fiona care about yellow carnations? Or was it the mention of the leather ledger? The obvious suspect was sitting right in front of her, practically weeping into his ale. But Agatha Raisin, with her sharp instincts and undeniable nosiness, knew she had just watched the real clue walk out the door. The murder of Julian Vane was not about church funds. It was about pride, vanity, and secrets kept under polite, perfectly manicured smiles. She drained her gin and tonic in one decisive gulp. "Do cheer up, Arthur," she said, standing and smoothing her blazer. "You're much too cowardly to be a murderer, but I would put that money back before Mrs. Blocksby finds out." Leaving the Pendletons to their miserable Sunday roast, Agatha strutted out of the Red Lion. She needed another gin, and she needed to find out exactly what secrets Fiona the beautician was hiding. Chapter 5. Mud Masks and Motives. Monday morning brought a harsh, unforgiving light through Agatha's bedroom window, illuminating a fresh, terrifying reality. She looked her age. Leaning over her bathroom sink, she inspected the fine lines around her eyes with the grim determination of a general surveying a lost battlefield. She pulled the skin taut, sighed heavily, and let it go. It was moments like these that made Agatha intensely vulnerable. She missed the soft, flattering lighting of her old London haunts, and she desperately missed the feeling of being undeniably in control. In Carsley, she was just an abrasive middle-aged woman with a loud voice and a terrible track record with men. But Agatha Raisin was not one to wallow. If she was feeling insecure, the best remedy was aggressive action. And today, that action involved a trip to the enemy's lair, the powder room, Fiona's fiercely overpriced beauty salon. It was strictly an investigative mission, Agatha told herself as she booked a deep tissue chemical peel. The glowing skin would merely be a tactical byproduct. The salon smelled aggressively of lavender and synthetic serenity. Enya was playing softly from hidden speakers, a sound Agatha always felt was best suited for elevators or waiting rooms in purgatory. Fiona, looking impossibly chic in a pristine white tunic, greeted her with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Agatha," Fiona said, her voice tight, "a chemical peel. We usually recommend a patch test for mature, sensitive skin." Agatha bristled at the word mature. My skin is perfectly resilient, Fiona. Much like my constitution. Let's just get on with it. Hona minik sanita. Agatha was entirely at Fiona's mercy. She was lying flat on a heated treatment bed, her hair wrapped tightly in a towel, while Fiona's cold fingers expertly massaged a gritty, stinging paste into her cheeks. It was a profoundly vulnerable position for an interrogation, but Agatha had never let a minor thing like physical disadvantage stop her. So, Agatha mumbled, trying not to move her upper lip so the paste wouldn't crack. Terrible shame about Julian Vane. Did you know him well? Fiona's fingers stilled for a fraction of a second on Agatha's forehead. Just in passing, we were both business owners, naturally. Now, Agatha, I need you to relax your jaw. You're carrying a lot of tension. I carry tension because people lie to me, Agatha retorted, opening one eye to glare up at the beautician. For instance, someone who only knew a man in passing wouldn't drop a wineglass simply because I mentioned his black book of secrets, or yellow carnations. Fiona's hands withdrew entirely. She turned her back to the treatment bed, pretending to fuss with a tray of steaming towels. I dropped the glass because I have a clumsy streak, and I don't know anything about yellow carnations. Oh, stop it, Fiona, Agatha said, pushing herself up onto her elbows, indifferent to the fact that her face was currently covered in what looked like wet cement. You're a terrible liar. Your hands are shaking. Chloe, Julian's mousy little assistant, told me all about the language of flowers. Yellow carnations mean rejection, disdain. Fiona whirled around, her glamorous facade cracking like a cheap mirror. You don't know what you're talking about, Agatha. You swan in here from London, throwing your weight around, thinking you understand everyone. I understand that you were sleeping with him, Agatha guessed wildly, relying entirely on her gut instinct and the sudden, furious flush on Fiona's neck. Fiona gasped, stepping back. She looked wildly toward the closed door of the treatment room, as if afraid her wealthy, agonizingly dull fiancé Marcus was lingering in the hallway. It was a mistake, Fiona hissed, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. A stupid, flattering mistake. Julian was charming. He made me feel exciting. But then he found out about Marcus. He found out Marcus was financing the salon. Agatha felt a triumphant thrill. Got you. Let me guess. Julian wanted a piece of Marcus's pie. Fiona nodded miserably, tears welling in her perfectly mascaraed eyes. He wanted Marcus to invest in his floral expansion instead of my new laser equipment. He told me that if I didn't convince Marcus to hand over £20,000, he was going to tell him everything. And then, just to be cruel, he had a box delivered here to the salon on Wednesday, right in front of my junior staff. A dozen yellow carnations. Agatha swung her legs over the side of the bed. The pieces were locking together perfectly. So, you went to the flower show on Saturday. You slipped into the potting shed to plead with him. He laughed at you, and you grabbed the nearest piece of ribbon. No, Fiona choked out a sob, burying her face in her hands. I didn't. I swear to you, Agatha. I went to the shed, yes. I was going to beg him. But when I got there, he was already dead. Agatha paused. Dead? What time was this? Right as the brass band started playing, Fiona whispered. Just past 2 o'clock. I saw him lying there. I panicked. I just ran. Agatha stared at the weeping woman. If Fiona was telling the truth, the timeline was all wrong. The police, and Agatha herself, had assumed the murder happened right before Miss Simpkins found the body at 2:30. If Julian was dead at 2, someone else had gotten to him first. Fiona, Agatha said sharply, abandoning the interrogation to wipe the drying cement from her face with a damp towel. Did you see anyone else near the shed? Anyone at all? Fiona sniffled, looking up. I don't know. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Bloxby, was walking away from that direction carrying her tea tray. And James Lacey. I saw James standing near the back hedges, looking terribly grim. Agatha froze, the towel halfway across her cheek. The thrilling rush of the chase vanished, replaced by an icy, heavy dread in the pit of her stomach. James. She remembered James's warning at the fete. She remembered how quickly he had appeared after the scream. Agatha slowly wiped the rest of the mask away, her mind racing. Surely James Lacey wasn't involved in a florist's blackmail scheme. But as she looked at her pale reflection in the salon mirror, Agatha realized with a sinking heart that in a village like Carsley, everyone had something to hide. Chapter 6. Secrets Under Polite Smiles. Agatha fled the powder room with a face glowing from her chemical peel and a mind storming with ugly, unwelcome doubts. She drove back to her cottage with white knuckles clamped around the steering wheel, her usual confidence shaken to its core. James. It couldn't be James. True, he was moody, aloof, and possessed a mysterious past that he guarded like a state secret. But murder? That was for sordid city thugs or frantic beauticians pushed to the edge, not retired military officers with impeccable posture and a devastating smile. Yet Fiona's words echoed mockingly in her head. James standing near the back hedges, looking terribly grim. Agatha paced her pristine kitchen, ignoring the hopeful yowls of Hodge and Boswell weaving around her ankles. She needed to clear the air. She needed to look James in the eye and hear him explain away his presence at the scene of the crime. Without pausing to reconsider, she marched out her front door, crossed the gravel driveway, and pounded aggressively on James Lacey's front door. It took 3 long, agonizing minutes before the heavy oak door swung open. James stood there in a faded plaid shirt and dark trousers, looking distinctly rumpled. He didn't look like a dashing hero. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with his own ghosts. "Agatha," James said, raising a skeptical eyebrow. "If you've come to critique my garden, you'll find the weeds are entirely my own business." "I haven't come about your weeds, James," Agatha shot back, bypassing him entirely and marching straight into his hallway. She didn't wait for an invitation. She strode right into his sitting room and spun around to face him as he closed the front door behind her. "Well," James said, crossing his arms and leaning against the doorframe with an infuriatingly calm demeanor. "This is a dramatic entrance, even for you. Has another florist offended your delicate sensibilities?" "Julian Vane is dead, James, and you know it," Agatha snapped, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of anger and raw, uncharacteristic anxiety. "And I happen to know that you were seen near the potting shed right around the time he was killed." James's relaxed posture didn't change, but his eyes, those sharp, cool blue eyes, hardened instantly. "Is that so? And who told you that?" "Fiona," Agatha said, watching him like a hawk for any micro-expression of guilt. "She saw you standing by the back hedges, looking grim." "What were you doing there, James? Were you admiring the mulch, or were you tying a crimson ribbon around a man's neck?" For a second, silence hung heavy in the room. Then, a low, humorless chuckle escaped James's throat. He pushed off the doorframe and walked over to his drinks trolley, pouring himself a finger of whiskey without offering her any. "Fiona has a flair for melodrama," James said quietly, taking a sip. "As do you, Agatha." "Don't patronize me." Agatha advanced a step, her fists clenched at her sides. "A man was murdered. Half the village is hiding secrets. Arthur Pendleton is embezzling. Fiona was being blackmailed, and you are lurking by the crime scene. I demand to know what you were doing there." James turned back to face her, his expression turning grave. The banter drained out of the room, leaving a heavy, suffocating tension. "If you must know," James said slowly, "I went to speak to Vane." Agatha's breath hitched. "To speak to him about what?" "About a debt," James admitted, looking away for a brief, uncomfortable moment. "Not money, a debt of honor. Julian Vane was a parasite who wormed his way into people's private lives. A few months ago, he stumbled upon a rather painful chapter from my past in London, something I preferred to keep buried. He tried to use it to secure an exclusive landscaping contract for the village green. He was squeezing me, Agatha." Agatha stared at him, her heart sinking like a stone. You were being blackmailed too?" "Yes," James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck with a tired hand. "I went to the potting shed on Saturday to put a stop to it once and for all. I intended to tell him that I didn't care what he printed or who he told, that I was done running from my past." "And when you got there?" Agatha whispered, dreading the answer. "He was already dead," James said simply, meeting her gaze dead on. "I walked into the shed, saw him lying among the roses, realized he had been strangled, and panicked. I knew that if the police found me hovering over the body with a motive, I'd be their prime suspect. So, I turned around and walked away." Agatha looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit. She wanted to believe him. God help her, she desperately wanted to believe him, because the thought of James sitting in a prison cell made her feel a sharp, hollow ache in her chest that she rarely admitted to having. "That's a very convenient story, James," Agatha said softly, her voice losing its combative edge. "It's the truth," James said, stepping closer to her. The familiar scent of his shaving soap filled her senses, blurring her sharper instincts. "Whether you choose to believe it is up to you." Agatha swallowed hard, backing up a step not out of fear, but out of self-preservation. The village was a web of lies, and everyone, including the man she was secretly falling for, was tangled up in it. "Well," Agatha said, lifting her chin with a flicker of her old pride, "the police are completely incompetent, which means if you didn't kill him, and Fiona didn't kill him, and Arthur didn't kill him, we have a very clever, very dangerous killer walking around Carsley." James offered a faint, tired smile. "And I suppose you intend to unmask them?" "Naturally," Agatha said, turning toward the door. "Someone has to protect this village from itself." "But James, if I find out you did do it?" "Yes?" James asked quietly. "I won't call the police," Agatha said over her shoulder, her eyes flashing. "I'll kill you myself." She marched out of his cottage, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The suspects were multiplying, the stakes were personal, and Agatha Raisin knew the game was only just beginning. Chapter 7. A second floral delivery. The atmosphere in Carsley had shifted from a mild, gossipy curiosity to a low-grade, suffocating paranoia. By Tuesday morning, you could practically cut the tension with one of Julian Vane's imported pruning shears. People were avoiding eye contact at the post office, whispering behind cupped hands in the butcher's queue, and locking their front doors in broad daylight. A radical, unheard-of step for a village where back doors were traditionally left wide open for stray cats and friendly neighbors. Agatha sat at her kitchen table, aggressively attacking a piece of charred toast with a butter knife, while staring at her handwritten suspect list. Arthur Pendleton, embezzler, blackmailed over church funds, but too cowardly to tie a knot. Fiona, blackmailed over salon financing, discovered the body at 2 p.m., panicked. James Lacey, blackmailed over a mysterious London past, present at the scene, fiercely defensive. She crossed out Arthur's name with a vicious slash of her pen. The man was a blustering idiot. He lacked the cold, calculating nerve required to stage a murder among the white roses. That left Fiona and James, or worse, someone entirely off her radar. A sharp, impatient rap at her front door startled her out of her brooding. Agatha dropped her toast, smoothed down her smart grey trousers, and strode to the door. She yanked it open, fully expecting Inspector Wilkes or some terrified village busybody. Instead, standing on her doorstep was a young delivery boy in a high-visibility vest, holding a large, cylindrical cardboard box tied with a familiar, stomach-churning length of crimson Florist's ribbon. Agatha froze, her breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" she demanded, pointing a rigid finger at the box. "Delivery for an Mrs. A. Raisin," the boy chirped cheerfully, entirely oblivious to the impending psychological crisis he was handing over. "Sign here, please." With a trembling hand, Agatha scribbled her signature onto the electronic pad, grabbed the box as if it were a ticking time bomb, and slammed the door shut. She carried it gingerly to the kitchen, setting it down on the center island like a hazard in a laboratory. Hodge and Boswell padded over, sniffed the cardboard with absolute feline disdain, and promptly trotted back to the rug to groom themselves. Agatha reached out, her manicure clicking against the cardboard. She swallowed hard, untied the crimson ribbon, the exact same wire-edged ribbon used to strangle Julian Vane, and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of pristine white tissue paper, was a dozen aggressively vibrant, deeply insulting yellow carnations. Pinned to the stems was a small cream-colored card written in neat, elegant cursive. Agatha picked it up with 2 fingers, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She read the words aloud in a hollow whisper. "Your orchids were dreadful, Agatha, but your nosiness is fatal. Stop digging, or you'll be next." The kitchen suddenly felt suffocatingly small. A cold sweat broke out across the back of her neck. This wasn't a warning from a cornered amateur. It was a direct, calculated threat. The killer knew she was getting close. They knew she was sniffing around the black ledger, the secrets and the lies. Instead of freezing in terror, however, a slow, hot wave of pure, unadulterated fury surged up from her toes. How dare they? How dare some cowardly, garden-variety murderer try to intimidate Agatha Raisin in her own home? They had insulted her prized Mayfair-bought orchids. They had ruined her weekend, and now they were sending her threatening bouquets like cheap village thugs. Her fear instantly evaporated, replaced by a fierce, combative adrenaline. She snatched up the card and the crimson ribbon, grabbed her car keys, and stormed out of the house. She didn't care about discretion anymore. She didn't care about Wilkes or the slow wheels of rural justice. The killer had just made a critical error. They had underestimated Agatha's spite. 10 minutes later, Agatha's car tires crunched violently onto the gravel of the Carsley vicarage. She marched straight up to the front door and pounded on it with the force of an eviction notice. It took a moment before Mrs. Bloxby opened it, looking serene in a blue linen dress, holding a stack of parish newsletters. "Agatha, my word." Mrs. Bloxby blinked, taking in Agatha's blazing eyes and rigid posture. "You look as though you're ready to declare war." "I am," Agatha declared, holding up the box of yellow carnations like a smoking gun. "Margaret, I need to talk to you, and I need you to tell me everything you saw on Saturday afternoon when you were carrying your tea tray near the potting shed." Mrs. Bloxby's serene expression faltered just a fraction, her eyes dropping to the bright yellow blooms in Agatha's hands. A heavy, telling silence stretched between them for 3 agonizing seconds. "Step inside, Agatha," the vicar's wife said softly, her voice losing its usual cheerful cadence. "Let's put the kettle on. I rather think we have a lot to discuss." Chapter 8. Tea, sympathy, and a missing page. The vicarage study smelled comfortably of old paper, pipe tobacco, and floor wax, but the atmosphere inside the room was as cold and sharp as winter frost. Mrs. Bloxby set a bone china teapot on the low wooden table between them. Her hands were perfectly steady, though her eyes, usually a well of endless, gentle patience, looked troubled. She poured the amber liquid into 2 delicate cups without a word, pushing one toward Agatha. Anna mia. Agatha didn't touch the tea. Instead, she laid the box of yellow carnations and the threatening card directly onto the center of the table, right next to a stack of parish hymn sheets. "Someone left this on my doorstep 20 minutes ago, Margaret," Agatha said, her voice dangerously quiet, using the exact same wire-edged ribbon that was wrapped around Julian Vane's neck. "The killer knows I'm onto them, which means they've been watching me." On Mrs. Blocksby sighed, a soft, sorrowful sound. She looked down at the bright, mocking yellow petals before finally lifting her gaze to meet Agatha's. "I was afraid of that, my dear. When you first took an interest in poor Julian's demise, I knew you wouldn't let it rest. But this is dangerous." "I am not afraid of a murderer hiding behind a herbaceous border," Agatha snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "What I want to know is what you saw on Saturday. Fiona told me she saw you walking away from the potting shed just before 2 o'clock, right around the time Julian was killed." Instead of looking defensive or shocked, Mrs. Blocksby merely nodded slowly. She reached out and poured herself a small sip of tea. "Fiona's eyesight is remarkably good for someone who spends all day staring at chemical peels," Mrs. Blocksby remarked mildly. "Yes, I was at the potting shed just before 2 on Saturday. I had taken a tray of tea out for Julian. He had been working since dawn, arranging the displays, and I thought a bit of kindness was in order." Agatha leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "And was he alive when you gave him the tea?" "He was," Mrs. Blocksby confirmed. "He was sitting on an upturned crate, looking rather pleased with himself, actually. He had that dreadful smug smile he always wore, the look of a man who held all the cards and knew it." "What cards?" Agatha pressed. "Did he mention the black ledger?" "He didn't need to mention it. I saw it," Mrs. Blocksby said, surprising Agatha with her candor. "It was sitting right there on his workbench, bound in worn leather. Julian was gloating about it. He told me that the village of Carsley was built on a foundation of polite hypocrisy, and that his little book was about to expose every rotten timber." Agatha's mind raced. "Did he say who he was going to expose next?" "He didn't get the chance," Mrs. Blocksby said softly. "As we were talking, someone else approached the shed." Julian's demeanor changed entirely. He looked panicked. For the first time since I'd known him, genuine fear crossed his face. "He told me I had to leave immediately." Agatha felt her breath catch. "Who was it, Margaret? Who did you see?" Mrs. Blocksby looked away, her expression tightening with regret. "I didn't see their face, Agatha. As I walked out the side door of the shed, I caught a glimpse of a familiar tweed jacket and a pair of polished brown shoes rounding the corner by the hedges. But the light was poor, and people share clothing styles in a village like this. I couldn't swear in a court of law whose shoes they were." "Tweed jacket and polished brown shoes," Agatha muttered, frantically running through the men in the parish. "Arthur Pendleton wore crumpled grey suits. James Lacey wore linen or casual wool. Who else?" Suddenly a cold realization washed over her. The parish committee. There were half a dozen respectable, wealthy men in Carsley who wore tweed and polished shoes every single day. "And the ledger?" Agatha asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "When Miss Simpkins found the body 20 minutes later, the police said the ledger was gone. Inspector Wilkes couldn't find a trace of it. Because it wasn't there when I left," Mrs. Blocksby said. "Or rather, when I returned to the vicarage, I realized I had left my linen tea napkin behind in the shed. I went back no more than 5 minutes later, just before the screaming started." Agatha stared at her, stunned. "And? The body was already there," Mrs. Blocksby said, her voice heavy with the weight of the secret she had been carrying. "Julian was lying among the white roses, and the leather ledger was missing from the workbench. Someone had taken it in that tiny window of time." Agatha sat back, her mind spinning. The timeline was tighter than she had realized, a matter of minutes. Someone had slipped into the shed, strangled Julian with his own ribbon to silence him permanently, and stolen the black book of secrets before Miss Simpkins stumbled upon the scene. "You didn't tell the police any of this, did you?" Agatha asked. Mrs. Blocksby offered a faint, melancholy smile. "Inspector Wilkes is a pompous fool who would have misunderstood half of it and terrorized the innocent. I knew you were investigating, Agatha. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that you might find the truth before the police tore the village apart with their clumsy assumptions." Agatha felt a strange, rare lump rise in her throat. The vicar's wife, the most respectable woman in Carsley, was effectively employing her as an unlicensed, highly aggressive private investigator. "Thank you, Margaret," Agatha said quietly, her usual prickly armor softening for a fraction of a second. She stood up, looking down at the box of yellow carnations on the table. "What are you going to do with those, my dear?" Mrs. Blocksby asked, nodding toward the threatening flowers. Agatha's jaw set, her eyes flashing with a sudden, brilliant, and utterly reckless spark of inspiration. The killer thought they could intimidate her with a bouquet and a card. They thought she was hiding in her cottage, trembling behind her locked doors. "Do?" Agatha murmured, a wicked, triumphant smirk spreading across her face. I'm going to do what any good PR executive does when faced with a hostile takeover. And what is that? I'm going to throw a party, Agatha declared, and invite every single suspect on my list. Let's see how well they keep their secrets when everyone is in the same room. Chapter 9. Agatha's Bold Gamble. The invitation had been issued with the lethal precision of a military campaign. By Wednesday evening, Agatha had personally called upon, cornered, or aggressively waylaid every relevant soul in Carsley and Dembley. She didn't frame it as an interrogation or a somber memorial. She called it an impromptu drinks reception to clear the air. Naturally, nobody dared refuse. In a village where social exclusion was a fate worse than exile, turning down an invitation from Agatha Raisin, especially when a murder was involved, was tantamount to a confession. Her cottage was packed to its absolute structural limit. The air was thick with the competing aromas of expensive French perfume, damp tweed, cheap red wine, and the underlying, simmering panic of 6 people who all had something desperately shameful to hide. Agatha stood near the fireplace, wearing a striking crimson dress that screamed absolute dominance. She held a gin and tonic in one hand, her sharp, beady eyes scanning the room like a hawk surveying a paddock of terrified rabbits. Arthur Pendleton was sweating profusely near the bookshelf, nervously clutching a glass of warm white wine as if it were a shield. Fiona stood a few feet away, rigidly leaning against the wall, casting suspicious glares at her fiancé, Marcus, who was busy chewing his fingernails. And near the window, standing completely detached from the crowd with a cool, inscrutable expression, was James Lacey. Agatha took a slow sip of her drink, cleared her throat, and struck a crystal glass lightly with her cocktail ring. Ting, ting, ting. The low, anxious hum of village gossip evaporated instantly. Every pair of eyes in the room snapped toward Agatha. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Agatha announced, her voice carrying the crisp, commanding authority of a high-powered London executive addressing a board of panicked shareholders. "I know how stressful life in the Cotswolds has been this week. Between the church roof funds going missing, secret salon financing falling apart, and the minor inconvenience of a man being strangled with his own decorative ribbon, I thought we all needed a little chat." Arthur Pendleton choked on his wine, letting out a wet, strangled cough. "Now see here, Mrs. Raisin, this is entirely inappropriate. Quiet, Arthur, or I'll tell Mrs. Pendleton about the blonde hair clips found in your vestry coat pocket." Agatha shot back effortlessly, not even blinking. Arthur turned a violent shade of plum and immediately clamped his mouth shut. A heavy, breathless hush fell over the room. Even James shifted, his blue eyes narrowing slightly as he watched Agatha command the space. "Julian Vane was a parasite," Agatha continued, pacing slowly across the Persian rug. "He knew it, and we knew it. He kept a little leather ledger filled with your dirty little secrets. Embezzlement, affairs, gambling debts, shady business deals. He thought that book made him untouchable. He thought he could squeeze every single one of you for money, contracts, or power." She stopped pacing and turned directly toward the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over the tense crowd. "On Saturday afternoon, right before the flower show, Julian was sitting in that potting shed with his little black book," Agatha said, her voice dropping to a dramatic, chilling register. "Someone went in there to buy his silence permanently. They strangled him with his own wire-edged ribbon, scooped up the ledger, and walked out before Miss Simpkins stumbled onto the body 20 minutes later." "And you think one of us did it?" Fiona asked, her voice cracking, her pristine makeup unable to mask the sheer terror in her eyes. "You think a murderer is just standing here drinking your cheap house wine?" "I don't think, Fiona." "I know," Agatha purred. She reached behind her back, picked up a heavy rectangular object wrapped in brown paper from the mantelpiece, and slammed it down onto the coffee table with a sharp thud. The room gasped in unison. It wasn't the leather ledger, it was a replica wrapped to look like it, tied with a familiar length of crimson ribbon. "Because the killer made a fatal mistake," Agatha said, leaning forward, her eyes locked on a specific target across the room. "They thought the ledger was gone for good, but they didn't realize that Julian Vane was far more paranoid than they were. He didn't just keep one book, he kept duplicate notes in a digital cloud file, backed up automatically to a laptop that the police and the killer missed entirely." A collective wave of absolute, unadulterated panic rippled through the room. People began shifting, darting nervous glances at the door, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. "The file contains every name, every transaction, and every threat," Agatha lied smoothly, spinning the fabrication with professional PR brilliance. "And as of 5 o'clock this afternoon, a complete copy of that file was automatically scheduled to be emailed directly to Inspector Wilkes. Unless the person who took the physical ledger from the scene steps forward right now and explains themselves." Silence slammed down on the cottage so hard you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hall. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Then, a sharp, ragged breath broke the tension. A figure stepped out from the shadows near the bookcase, their face pale, eyes wide and manic. The social mask had completely shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. Agatha turned to face them, a triumphant, lethal smile finally breaking across her face. Chapter 10. The Language of Retribution. Every eye in the cottage snapped toward the bookcase. Stepping forward into the amber glow of the lamps was Marcus, Fiona's immaculately groomed, agonizingly dull fiancé. But the polished, unshakable facade of the successful local businessman had entirely vanished. His face was the color of curdled milk, a fine sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead, and his hands were trembling so violently he had to shove them deep into his trouser pockets to hide it. "Marcus?" Fiona whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at him in sheer disbelief. "Marcus, what is he talking about?" "It's a bluff," Marcus babbled, his voice pitching uncomfortably high. He looked wildly around the room, finding no sympathy in the hard, unblinking stares of his neighbors. "She's lying. There is no digital cloud file. She's just trying to trick us." "Was I?" Agatha asked, stepping closer to him, her crimson dress catching the light like a flag of victory. "Because you sure cracked awfully fast for a man who claims I'm bluffing, Marcus. You didn't wait for Wilkes, and you didn't ask to see a warrant. You just exposed yourself." Marcus let out a ragged, ugly sound, half laugh, half sob, and slumped against the bookshelf, knocking a stray volume of poetry onto the floor. "He was ruining me," Marcus choked out, his eyes welling with furious, defeated tears. "I invested everything I had into Fiona's salon. It was my way of breaking out of this suffocating village, of feeling like a real man of substance. But Julian found out. He discovered that the initial capital didn't come from my savings. It came from a silent partnership with a liquidation firm in Bristol that I had no right tapping into." Fiona gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "You embezzled corporate funds to pay for my laser equipment." "I did it for us," Marcus snapped, glaring at her with a flash of bitter resentment. "And Julian used it like a crowbar. He didn't just want a cut. He wanted complete ownership leverage over the business. He laughed in my face when I begged for mercy on Thursday. He told me that by Saturday afternoon, he was going to fax the evidence straight to my business partners in Bristol." James Lacey broke his silent vigil by the window, his voice cutting across the room like a cold blade. "So you went to the fete on Saturday. You slipped into the potting shed right before 2 o'clock. "I went to beg him," Marcus cried, his voice breaking. "I took a box of yellow carnations I'd picked up from his own shop earlier that morning, just to show him I was willing to play ball. But when I got there, he wouldn't listen. He just sat on that crate, smiling that awful superior smile, telling me I was finished. Something just snapped." Marcus looked down at his own trembling hands, as if he couldn't quite believe what they had done. "The florist's ribbon was right there on the workbench," he whispered. "I didn't even think. I just grabbed it, pulled it tight, and didn't let go until the smiling stopped. Then I saw the black ledger on the desk, grabbed it, and ran out the back way just as the brass band started playing." A heavy, horrified silence descended upon the cottage. Arthur Pendleton looked like he might faint, while Fiona stared at the man she was supposed to marry as if he were a complete stranger. "And the threatening card sent to my house this morning?" Agatha demanded, her voice sharp as glass. "The yellow carnations on my doorstep." Marcus swallowed hard, looking straight at her. "That was me. I saw you poking around the shop, asking Chloe questions. I knew you were getting too close. I took a spare ribbon from my car and left the flowers to scare you off. I thought if I frightened you enough you'd drop it." "Scare me?" Agatha barked out a short, incredulous laugh, her pride flaring hot and bright. "You amateur. I survived 30 years of London PR executives and vicious media moguls. A nervous wreck with a roll of ribbon was never going to frighten me." Before Marcus could reply, heavy, familiar footsteps crunched aggressively onto the gravel outside. A sharp, authoritative knock rattled the front door. "Police! Open up!" Inspector Wilkes's irritable voice boomed through the wooden panels. Agatha didn't flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on Marcus for a final, glorious second before turning toward the door. She unlocked it and pulled it wide open, revealing Inspector Wilkes and a very bewildered-looking Constable Bill Wong standing on the porch. "Mrs. Raisin," Wilkes grunted, pushing past her into the hallway. "We received an anonymous tip about a disturbance here, and—" "Save your breath, Inspector," Agatha interrupted smoothly, gesturing regally toward the living room. "Your suspect is inside, currently confessing to embezzlement, blackmail, and murder. He even gift-wrapped the motive for you." Wilkes stared at Marcus, who had finally slumped into a chair in total defeat, and then looked at Agatha with a mixture of sheer exasperation and grudging, unspoken awe. By Thursday evening, the village of Carsley had returned to its aggressively polite, picturesque routine. The scandal of the murderous florist and the desperate fiancé had instantly eclipsed all previous village gossip, providing fuel for tea shops and pub corners for months to come. Agatha sat alone in her cottage, a glass of crisp white wine on the coffee table, and her 2 cats curled peacefully at her feet. The investigation was over. The killer was behind bars. The village was safe. Yet as she stared out the window into the gathering twilight, a familiar, quiet ache of loneliness settled into her chest. She had won, of course. She had solved the case where the police had failed, proving her sharp intellect to anyone who doubted it. But as she glanced across the dark lawn toward James Lacey's silent cottage, she wondered if she would ever find someone to share the quiet evenings with, without needing a murder mystery to bring them to her door. A sharp rap at her front door broke the stillness. Agatha blinked, startled. She stood up, smoothed down her skirt, and walked to the door. She pulled it open. James stood there on the porch, holding a bottle of expensive champagne and looking slightly more relaxed than usual. "I hear congratulations are in order, Agatha," James said, offering a slow, genuine smile that made her heart do a ridiculous, traitorous flutter. For solving the Cotswold's most inconvenient murder, Agatha's initial instinct was to snap at him, to keep her armor firmly in place. But looking into his eyes, she felt the rigid defenses melt away just a fraction. "It was nothing, James," Agatha purred, stepping aside to let him pass. "Though if you think a bottle of champagne makes up for calling me dramatic, you've got a lot to learn about Carsley." As James stepped into the warm light of her hallway, Agatha realized that village life might be full of gossip, rivalry, and murder. But it was never ever boring. And for now, that was quite enough. Chapter 11. The Aftermath and the Aperitif. Friday morning in Carsley dawned with an almost aggressive serenity. The sun beamed down on the honey-colored stone cottages, the hanging baskets overflowed with defiant geraniums, and the village green looked as though it had never played host to a frantic, wine-soaked confession or a florist's grim demise. Agatha Raisin woke up feeling exceptionally pleased with herself. She stretched luxuriously beneath her duvet, listening to the muffled, contented purrs of Hodge and Boswell at the foot of the bed. For the first time in a week, her mind wasn't racing with suspect lists, timelines, or hidden ledgers. The killer was locked safely in a police cell. Arthur Pendleton was frantically trying to quietly repay the church roof fund before the diocese noticed, and Fiona was reportedly already redecorating the powder room to distance herself from Marcus's catastrophic downfall. Agatha threw off the covers, humming softly to herself. She marched into the kitchen, dressed in a vibrant yellow linen dress that practically shouted triumph, and brewed a strong cup of coffee. She stepped out onto her back patio, mug in hand, breathing in the crisp Cotswold's air. It was a good day to be Agatha Raisin. She had saved the village from its own polite hypocrisy, outsmarted Inspector Wilkes yet again, and proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that moving from London to the country had done nothing to dull her razor-sharp instincts. Of course, village life being what it was, peace never lasted longer than a well-baked scone. As if on cue, the wooden gate at the end of her garden squeaked open. Mrs. Bloxby strolled up the paved path, carrying a small wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. The vicar's wife looked as unruffled and serene as ever, though a knowing, gentle amusement danced in her eyes. "Good morning, Agatha," Mrs. Bloxby called out cheerfully, stepping onto the patio. "I brought scones, still warm." "Margaret," Agatha beamed, setting her coffee mug down. Come in, sit down. Honestly, if you're here to tell me that the parish council is trying to pin Julian Vane's inventory bills on me, I refuse to listen." Mrs. Bloxby laughed softly, taking a seat at the iron garden table and lifting the checkered cloth to reveal 4 plump, golden scones. "No parish council business today, I promise. Though I did hear that Arthur Pendleton has taken up jogging in an effort to sweat out his sins. A terrifying visual for everyone involved." Agatha chuckled, pulling out a chair opposite her friend. "Serves him right. A bit of cardiovascular distress will do the man good." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, enjoying the morning sun while Mrs. Bloxby poured a cup of tea from a small thermos she had brought along. "You handled Wednesday evening quite brilliantly, you know," Mrs. Bloxby said quietly, buttering a scone. "It was unorthodox, theatrical, and entirely chaotic, but it worked." "Of course it worked," Agatha said, tossing her head with a flash of characteristic pride. "PR is all about narrative control, Margaret. You create a stage, you introduce a high-stakes conflict, and you let the guilty party sweat under the spotlight. Marcus never had the constitution for it. The moment I mentioned a digital cloud backup, he practically gift-wrapped his own confession." "And the digital cloud backup?" Mrs. Bloxby raised an inquiring eyebrow. "Was there actually one?" Agatha took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, a mischievous smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "What do you think?" Mrs. Bloxby chuckled, shaking her head. "I thought not. A magnificent bluff, Agatha, truly." "Desperate times call for dramatic storytelling," Agatha declared happily. They spent the next half hour discussing the absolute absurdity of village gossip, the impending trial of poor, foolish Marcus, and the local postmistress's latest theory that Julian Vane had actually been an undercover international spy, which Agatha firmly dismissed as nonsense, though she secretly thought it made a far better story than embezzlement. Eventually, Mrs. Bloxby packed up her basket, patted Agatha's hand with warm affection, and strolled back down the garden path, leaving Agatha alone with her thoughts and the warm Cotswold's breeze. The rest of the day drifted by in a pleasant, unhurried haze. Agatha pottered about her cottage, trimmed a few unruly rose bushes, and even managed to ignore the urge to check on her neighbours for a solid 4 hours, a personal best. Yet, as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the rolling hills, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, a familiar, quiet ache crept back into her chest. She walked over to the front window and peered out. Across the drive, James Lacey's cottage was quiet. The curtains were drawn back, but there was no sign of him. A strange, hollow feeling settled in her stomach. For all her bravado, her sharp tongue, and her undeniable thrill for the chase, Agatha was acutely aware of the empty space beside her. She loved the village, she loved the drama, and she adored solving puzzles. But sometimes, the silence of a country evening was terribly loud. "Oh, stop feeling sorry for yourself, Agatha Raisin," she scolded her reflection in the window glass, straightening her shoulders with a sharp tug. "You aren't some tragic heroine in a Bronte novel. You're a survivor." She turned away from the window, determined to pour herself a generous gin and tonic and lose herself in a trashy paperback. Before she could reach the drinks cabinet, a sharp, familiar rap echoed against her front door. Agatha froze. Her heart gave a sudden, traitorous leap. She hurried to the mirror in the hallway, swiftly patted down her hair, checked her lipstick with a practiced squint, and strode to the door. She yanked it open. James stood on the porch. He wasn't holding a bottle of champagne this time, but he was holding a small, perfectly wrapped square package tied with a neat, unpretentious piece of twine. No crimson Florist's ribbons in sight. "Good evening, Agatha," James said, his lips curving into that slow, devastating smile. "James," Agatha replied, crossing her arms defensively over her chest, keeping her best skeptical expression firmly in place. "If you've come to complain about my rose bushes encroaching on your property line, I warn you, I have gardening shears and I'm not afraid to use them." James chuckled, holding up the small package. "No complaints. In fact, I came to apologize." Agatha blinked, genuinely startled. "Apologize? James Lacey? Heavens, has the world ended and nobody told me? I apologize for being entirely too predictable, for lurking near hedges, and for making you do all the heavy lifting while the police blundered about," James said smoothly, stepping a little closer to the doorway. "And I brought a peace offering." He handed her the small package. Agatha took it gingerly, her fingers brushing against his. She untied the twine, normal brown string thankfully, and unwrapped the paper. Inside was a small, beautifully bound vintage notebook with blank pages, and a sleek, expensive silver fountain pen resting across the cover. Agatha looked up at him, her hard exterior melting away, leaving a soft, genuine warmth in her eyes. "What's this for? So you can write down your next set of suspects," James said quietly, his blue eyes holding hers with an intense, unreadable warmth. "Though I sincerely hope your next investigation doesn't involve a murder. My nerves can't take you barging into my house accusing me of strangling florists every weekend." Agatha let out a bright, genuine laugh, the last remnants of her loneliness evaporating completely. "Well," Agatha purred, stepping aside and gesturing into the warm, lit hallway. "I make no promises, James, but since you're here, would you like a gin and tonic? I happen to have some very fresh ice." James stepped across the threshold, closing the front door behind him. The village of Carcelli was quiet. The mystery was solved, and Agatha Raisin was right back where she belonged, surrounded by secrets, sharp banter, and the intoxicating, unpredictable thrill of life. Chapter 12. A Toast to the Cotswolds. The ice in Agatha's crystal tumbler clinked softly as she swirled her gin and tonic, watching James settle into the plush armchair opposite her sofa. The warm glow of the lamps chased away the deepening blue of the twilight outside, turning her cozy sitting room into a sanctuary of refined comfort. Hodge, ever the opportunist, immediately abandoned his rug and hopped uninvited onto James's lap, kneading his paws against the fabric of the man's trousers with rhythmic devotion. "Traitor," Agatha remarked from the kitchen counter, though a fond smile played at the corners of her lips. "The cat cares nothing for loyalty, James. He only cares who has the most forgiving lap and the highest tolerance for shedding." James stroked Hodge's head, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Cats are excellent judges of character, Agatha. They recognize a safe harbor when they see one." "A safe harbor," Agatha repeated, turning around with a fresh slice of lemon held between her fingers. She dropped it into her drink. "In Carsley. That's rich. This village is less of a safe harbor and more of a breeding ground for passive-aggressive gossip and floral assassinations. And yet, James pointed out, his blue eyes glinting with amusement, you wouldn't trade it for Mayfair right now, would you? Agatha paused, the lemon slice still in her hand. She looked around her cottage, at the beamed ceilings, the stacks of notes from her various amateur investigations, the snoring cats, and the man sitting in her chair looking entirely too much at home. A year ago, if someone had told her she would be living in a sleepy Cotswolds village, gossiping with vicars' wives, and matching wits with a cynical ex-military neighbor over the murder of a snobbish florist, she would have laughed them out of her PR office. Back then, life was measured in press releases, launch parties, and the hollow, frantic rush of London nightlife. Here, life had texture, it had colour, sharp edges, and people who actually noticed when she walked into a room. Mayfair is overrated, Agatha declared briskly, walking over and handing James his refilled glass before sinking into her own sofa. Too much concrete, not enough scandalous village council members to keep one's mind sharp. God forbid your mind should ever be dull, James said dryly, raising his glass in a silent toast. Indeed, Agatha replied, clinking her glass against his with a sharp, clear ring. They sat in companionable silence for a long moment, the quiet evening wrapping around them like a warm blanket. For Agatha, this was the rarest of luxuries, a moment of complete and total contentment that didn't require a performance, a clever scheme, or a defensive retort. The danger had passed, the mystery was neatly buttoned up, and her pride was intact. Yet, as she looked at James, she knew the peace wouldn't last forever. Carsley was a magnet for eccentric characters and buried secrets. Sooner or later, another body would turn up in a churchyard, another local rivalry would boil over, or another snooty newcomer would test her legendary patience. And when they did, Agatha Raisin would be right there in the thick of it, probably wearing the wrong shoes, marching into places she didn't belong, and thoroughly enjoying every single second. Penny for your thoughts, James murmured, breaking the silence. Though judging by the look in your eye, they're either deeply romantic or thoroughly illegal. Agatha blinked, snapping out of her reverie. She offered a slow, wicked, and entirely unapologetic grin. I was just thinking, James, Agatha purred, leaning forward and resting her chin in her hand. The summer fete is over, but the autumn horticulture show is only 3 months away, and I happen to know that the committee is looking for a new guest judge. James groaned softly, throwing his head back against the cushions. God help us all. Oh, hush, Agatha laughed, her voice ringing out bright and clear in the cozy room. I'm thinking of entering a proper arrangement this time. Something subtle, something sophisticated, something lethal, James suggested, raising an eyebrow. Naturally, Agatha replied, raising her glass once more. To the Cotswolds, James. May they never be peaceful. As they drank to chaos, gossip, and the sweet, vindictive thrill of a mystery solved, Agatha Raisin settled back into her cushions, utterly at home in the heart of the village.